In this video, I'm going to explain to you your histogram and why it's important that you understand it to get a properly exposed photograph. I'm also going to show you how sometimes your camera can get it particularly wrong, especially in those auto modes like aperture priority. And this applies to scenes that will be very dark, contain a lot of blacks, or alternatively very light and contain a lot of whites. And quite often your camera will make those look mid-grey, and I'll show you why it does that and how to get round it. Welcome to Nifty 50 Photographers. I'm Richard Gill. I'm a professional photographer, and on this channel I provide photography tutorials for those who are a little bit older, perhaps with a bit of grey in their hair, or maybe not much hair left at all. If that sounds like you, please do subscribe to the channel, and hopefully you'll enjoy these videos. Now let's talk about the histogram. A histogram is just a pictorial representation of the light in your photograph. So we have blacks at one side, whites at the other, and grey in the middle. And those of you who watch my white balance video will know that the camera is always trying to aim for this 18% mid-grey. Now what's in the black area is anything that's in the shadows, and in the white area are all your highlights, and the sort of mid-exposure is what's in the middle, and you'll end up with some weird and wacky curves that show you what the makeup is, and that is going to entirely depend upon what you're photographing. Now, as photographers, what we're interested in is making sure our photograph is correctly exposed. But let's first understand what the curves look like. So I'll just get rid of that and we'll start again. So if I was to take a picture of a very dark scene, something with a lot of black in it, then it would be here over to the left hand side of the curve. Similarly, if I was to take a picture with a lot of white in, then it would be over on this side to the right, because there is a lot of stuff in the white and the light areas of our scene. Let me just get rid of that as well, and let's show you what we want to try and avoid. So if we have a very dark scene and we have got our settings slightly wrong and the photograph's underexposed, the danger is the curve will plot something like that. This is our blacks, remember, and the problem area is this here, and this is what we call clipped. And simply clipping means the camera hasn't been able to measure this bit of data, so you've lost that from your photograph. Now if I'd overexposed the photograph, for example, with a lot of white in it, maybe a landscape with a lot of sky in, for example, then I might have had the same sort of problem here. This is our whites, and this area is clipped, and that's what we are trying to avoid. So if you see instances like this where your curve is bang up against either the right hand side or the left hand side, there is a danger that it has been clipped. So what you're really trying to check to see if your photograph is perfectly exposed is that your curve has a tiny bit of space here and here, and if it does, that means you haven't clipped anything, so you've captured all the data that you're trying to get hold of. So I've set up my camera with one of the world's most boring subjects, a grey card, to show you how this works out in practice. So you'll see the histogram there in the bottom right hand corner is pretty much centered around the middle because it's looking at grey, so remember that mid-grey. There's a little bit of stuff in the left and right hand side of the histogram, and that's because there is a white square and also a black square, so it's showing the details of those as well. Now let's look at something different. We'll swap the grey card for a white card. And now you'll see that the histogram has moved entirely across to the right hand side because it's got a purely white scene. Now if I put something in there that is purely black, I'll get it to shift entirely to the left. So there's a black scene, and it's shifted the histogram entirely to the left hand side. Now for all these that I've just showed you, I've set the camera to a manual exposure. Now remember, I explained that the camera is trying to make everything 18% grey. If I let it try and make its own decisions now, you'll be interested to see what happens, and this is another clue as to whether your histogram is matching your picture. So let me just change the settings on the camera. What I've done now is I've set the camera to aperture priority. Now it's trying to make the scene mid-grey, so you see that what I was a purely black scene, it has now shifted the histogram into the middle, and the scene looks wrong. The image it's displaying me on the back of the camera looks wrong. It's gone grey. So that's something else to look out for when you're checking your histogram. Does it actually look right for the kind of scene I'm trying to photograph? And clearly it doesn't in that case. If I do the same thing with white, you'll see it's done the same thing again. It shifted that histogram in the middle to try and create this mid-grey. It's turned the white card into something that looks grey and not white. And finally, if I flip that over and we go back to grey, you can see that now it's got a curve pretty much in the middle. Center that up, and it's looking something pretty close to what it should do. So that's how this sort of whole mid-grey setup works. So it's not often you're going to want to take a picture of something as exciting as a grey card. So let's go out into the field now and see how the histogram works in a real life situation, and how you can use that to make sure you get those photos just exposed the way you need them to. I'm outside now, just come up along the old canal to find a suitable location to show you how I would use the histogram to check I've got the exposure right. You can see it's a beautiful spring day. Got my four-legged companion Obi with me again. And so we've got this canal bridge on the right. In the distance there on the left you can see a place called Sedgwick House, which is a sort of fine Victorian mansion. And we're going to frame this first with 2/3 of the land, so the horizon is 2/3 of the way up the screen, and you can see the histogram. It's got a peak towards the shadows and another peak towards the highlights, which is the sky, of course. And if you take that shot, you can see how it's come out, and it's come out fairly well, nothing too bad. You can see it's very close to the highlights. It looked as though they might be clipped. And it runs right out actually into the shadows, and if you look really closely at the shadows, they might be just a tiny bit clipped, and that's probably the very dark bit under the arch of the canal, the old canal bridge. And there you can see it after being developed, and the blue bits that I've highlighted there are showing where the shadows are just very slightly clipped. Now, I did tell you in a previous video about white balance that mid-grey is lush green grass, and you can see that clearly on this histogram, how it's sat right in the middle there, so that's your mid-grey. Okay, let's frame this now with the horizon a third of the way up. So the camera is going to set its exposure to the sky. And let's see what the histogram looks like for that. And you can see it looks pretty good. Now it's shifted more towards the left because we set the exposure based on the brightest part of the image, but actually it's come out, in my opinion, a slightly nicer image because the sky has been exposed correctly. All these shots are straight out of camera. And if you look at that after being developed, it's pretty much the same, just a little bit of shadow clipping under the arch. I'm going to move to another location. I'm going to follow the river down and come to this bridge, which is a bridge for a dual carriageway, so there's traffic running overhead and the river running underneath, but it does provide lots of contrasting light. So we've got the very bright highlights from the sky in the left of the image, and as we get under the arch here you can see the shadows formed by the bridge, some highlights in the river from the reflected sky. And over here on my right, where the footpath goes, we've got sunlight coming in on the right, creating a bright spot, and then the dark bit at the back of the pathway there. So let's take an image looking this way. I like the way the curves run. I'm going to frame that with the curve running from the top left hand corner, and you see my histogram is pretty centered now, because I've managed to, by the way I framed it, I've managed to cut out the really bright bits, and so that's giving a fairly even exposed image, and you can see the histogram right in the middle there. And if we look at that in the actual photo, you can see that's pretty good. If anything, just a tiny bit of highlight clipping. It's probably in the top left hand corner where there's a little bit of sky there, and that's probably what's causing that little bit of highlight clipping, but in all honesty it's not something I'm going to worry about for this photo. Now let's look at this really challenging area where I've got some really bright light and some very dark areas, so really strong contrast in this photo. And you see the histogram spread right across from shadows to highlights. And my issue is going to be trying to get the exposure right without blowing out my highlights, without them being clipped. So I'm going to have to try and set the exposure a little bit under to try and avoid those highlights being blown away. And as you'll see in the image, what I've done is I've underexposed it, so I've exposed to the left, and I've just managed to avoid the highlights being clipped. I may have gone a bit too far and got the shadows clipped very slightly. That's what that little red triangle is warning me about. But in all honesty, they will probably be in the shadows where this water's leaked onto the pathway, where it's very dark, so I'm not going to worry that I've lost any detail in there, because it's not really an integral part of the image. What I was wanting to get is the contrast of the light on the stone. Now let's do one final shot, and I'm going to look down this sort of dark tunnel of the pathway, use that as some well, they're not really leading lines because it's not leading to a subject, but they lead you into the photo at least. So it's what, strictly speaking, is called a pathway. And now what I'm really worried about is the shadows, so I'm particularly paying attention to the left hand side of the histogram and making sure I don't clip out the shadows, because I want to get all this stone structure in there. And so I'm going to, if anything, again try and push the exposure up a little bit. I might overexpose very slightly to ensure I don't lose any detail in those shadows. And in the image you can see I've got really quite a good spread of light in the histogram. If anything, again, I might have a tiny bit of clipping in the shadows. Now there's one other area where it's important to know how your histogram relates to your photograph or what you've just seen, and that's if you're going to print your photographs. Quite often if you see a mismatch between the printing intensity and what you saw on the back of your camera or on your computer monitor, then you need to make an adjustment. You need to make your photograph perhaps brighter, overexpose it a little bit, or perhaps darker, underexpose it a little bit. So it's good to compare something that's printed and look at that histogram, and you'll know then what you need to do. So if your photos are always printing a bit dark, you need to overexpose them slightly. And really it's a question of trial and error for your setup. Certainly as a beginner it is anyway. And just try tweaking the exposure, maybe half a stop or a third of a stop, and see if you get the intensity you want to match to get a good print. Similarly, if they're going dark, do the opposite the other way, so underexpose them by a part of a stop or a whole stop if necessary. Now, all this should be getting you revved up to go straight into manual mode. But if you've still got some things you'd like explaining in more detail, let me know in the comments below, and I'll be happy to make a video about those so you fully understand all your camera functions and not scared to use that manual mode. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you give it a like, and do subscribe to the channel and come back and watch our next video. I look forward to seeing you then.